Coffee Talk. Joining us today is the Director of Professional Services with Lexipol, Bill McAuliffe, joining us from Idaho. Bill, welcome to Coffee Talk today.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
And yeah, thanks for taking some time out to be with us. Just for everybody involved here, we always start off with one very particular question. Kind of sets the mood for the rest of our time together, and that is, how do you take your coffee?
Cream and sugar.
Cream and
is
sugar.
my preferred way to take my coffee.
And that's a little bit deviated from most law enforcement officers who, for some reason, always say take it black because I worked a lot of nights and I had to take it that way to stay up. Can you elaborate on why cream and sugar now?
Because I can. When I was in patrol, and I sympathize with those guys and gals, because many years I did drink coffee black because I had to, but now I'm in my office and I don't have to drink it black, so I drink it with cream and sugar.
So Bill, a little bit about your background. How long did you serve in law enforcement, and then how did you make that jump to where you are now with Lexipol?
So I did 22 years in civilian law enforcement, did about 3 years before that in the Coast Guard Reserve doing maritime law enforcement. Started my career in California with the sheriff's office down there on the Central Coast. And then after 10 years, escaped the great state of California for Idaho and finished my career up here up on the panhandle of Idaho.
And in your law enforcement career, Bill, I'm assuming that you wrote a policy or two along the way, and how did that segue into your next career with Lexipol?
That's a great question. I was thinking about that a little bit before, and the first policy I ever wrote was a canine policy when I was trying to bring back a canine unit from my first agency. We had gone about 20 years without canines, and I was trying to bring that unit back. So part of my due diligence in making the business case to the sheriff was putting everything together, including the budget and the policy. And then later on in my career, when I came to Idaho and I started promoting up through the ranks, dabbled a little bit in basically maintaining policy, not necessarily writing new stuff, but improving what we had. And then when I promoted to lieutenant, I was the professional standards lieutenant, so I oversaw the policy manual, internal affairs, all the other admins type stuff in the office, and we were a Lexipol customer. And so that's where I got the introduction not only to Lexipol, but deep dive into policy and policy maintenance and training and internal affairs, which is very heavily related to policy. So that's where I really fine-tune my skills, if you will, on the policies and necessities and the Lexipol philosophy.
Bill, full disclosure, I'm a retired police chief, as you know, from Indiana. We were also a Lexipol customer for policy, so I'm familiar with the solution, and makes me ask the next question: the policy or the body camera? What really comes first, do you think?
They really have to be synchronized. You definitely don't want your body-worn camera or any piece of equipment, for that matter, out there in the field without some kind of governance around it. So you can have your policy ready and even have it issued to your folks before you release your equipment, but you should definitely have your policy and your equipment synchronized, because as you guys know, being in the business, there's a lot of differences between the pieces of equipment you can buy and the technology changes. So you need to make sure you have the right policy for the right equipment. And so it really is kind of a synchronized, delicate dance, if you will, to make sure that they're in close proximity. But definitely, if you're going to put one before the other, I would make sure I had the policy in place first.
Sure, and I couldn't agree with you more. When you talk about body camera policies, and everybody's out there searching for, one that is tailored for their agency, that fits the needs of the administration, of the officer, of the community. But when we talk policy for body cameras, it usually, in my experience, is a bit more complex because it touches so many other policies, specifically use of force. Can you talk about that weave of policy as it relates to body cameras and all the other aspects of an agency that a body camera policy probably is intertwined with?
Sure. So, great point. Body worn camera. A lot of what we see, especially in the press these days, is body worn camera around use of force. But when you look at a policy manual, it really is somewhat of a brick and mortar system where no one policy can really stand on its own. Policies need to rely on each other. Sometimes they're direct reference to other policies. Other times it's just inferred, but you really can't have one policy that just stands by itself. So as you're fine tuning your body worn camera policy, you're going to be wanting to look at those other policies like evidence retention, use of force, all those types of other policies that could be related or impacted by the use of, a body worn camera. So you have to take a holistic approach to your policy manual, not just look at that one policy. You really have to start kind of throw the pebble in the pond and then see where those ripples go and make sure you're touching base with those to make sure you have applicability and practicality and functionality throughout the policy manual, not just have that laser focus on the policy for body worn.
Sure, and that makes perfect sense. Writing a policy is so much different than it used to be, as it plays into that system that you're talking about, that overlay, and touches so many other aspects of not just a law enforcement agency, but maybe the community in whole. I know that Lexipol is a national company, and you guys have customers in many states. How often are you seeing that evolve to where communities are having input with the body camera policy across the country?
Yeah, so for law enforcement, we're in 35 states across the country. So we have state-specific policies for each of those states. And we've always encouraged agencies to include the community at some level of policy review, whether creating new policy or reviewing their existing policies. Mm-hmm. And it's becoming more prolific now. The community members are actually starting to reach out and wanting to be more a part of it. And agencies are starting to understand more and more the importance of having community involvement in their policy review and making sure that they have those perspectives covered and the transparency, so that the community that they're serving understands what their officers are doing out there in the field when they're seeing them, engage with other people. They have a better understanding of what's really going on there, not kind of their own perceived idea or maybe that Hollywood-driven perspective.
More opportunity, you think, these days for communities to be involved, and not maybe only a body camera policy, but others that are of concern as we move into a new era of policing?
Yeah, absolutely. Our position at Lexipol is that it's good to have community involvement in most of your critical policies. Use of force, pursuit. I mean, you name them, those hot button topics. When you start looking at a policy manual like the Lexipol driven policies that an agency will have, you can have 165, 170 policies, and we got to admit, policy is not sexy. So they might be citizen members might be really intrigued at first, but when you start to get into some of the more mundane policies like, what equipment you use or how what your uniform looks like, and those other policies, they're not going to have the interest there. And that really isn't policy that they should have a lot of interest. You would expect them to have a lot of interest in. They're going to be more interested in those hot button topics, right? Use of force, handcuffing, taser, body worn camera, pursuit, all those, and then get into that discussion with them and get them involved with those policies and keep it to those critical policies, not get into the more mundane.
Bill, you're clearly a subject matter expert in policy for law enforcement agencies.
Thank you.
Former police chief here, so sometimes you gotta really dumb it down for me. What are the focus points for policy that you really concentrate on, that you really want to focus on?
With any policy that an agency is looking at, whether they're enacting a new policy or even reviewing their existing policies, as they go through it, they need to keep in mind that the policy needs to be applicable, practical, and functional for their organization. Many years, and when I drafted that first K-9 policy, that's how I did it. I went out to borrow from a buddy program, right? You go to other agencies that you think are squared away or maybe have a good record and are operationally sound, and you go borrow copies, and then you piecemeal your own together, taking what you think from each is the right thing. And a lot of agencies still do that, but the danger there is you don't know who wrote that initial one, whether it's legally defensible. And if you just start adopting policy because it sounds good, you could be setting yourself up for greater liability, and putting your operators in the field in a really difficult position, because you want to make sure your policy is not only applicable, practical, functional for your organization, but you need to have conformance between what your policy says and what your procedures say, right? Your policy are those guidelines that give direction as to who's to do what you can do, what you shall not do, and then the procedure is how you do a particular task. So if you don't have conformance between your policy and your procedure, you're just going to open yourself up to greater liability. You're going to cause more confusion within your organization, and then that's just going to cascade into other bad events happening where you get criticized and you end up on the 24-hour news cycle.
Right. Maybe, Bill, I'm putting you on the spot here, but maybe some of the biggest pitfalls out there to implementing a body camera program as it relates to the policy that we're putting out there for officers to adhere to.
Excellent question. And again, this relates to body-worn camera policy as well as just about any other policy you have in your manual. You've got to remember that you cannot write a policy that is going to cover every scenario, every possible scenario. So you've got to write a policy that is broad enough, that gives good guidance, keeps your people in line with what your expectations are, what the legal requirements are. But you've got to have a good mixture of policy training, not only policy training on the policy, but training on the equipment. And then you've got to provide the opportunity for discretion. And as you know, coming from the industry, cops are out there in the field making split-second decisions based on very limited information. So you've got to take everything into consideration and just expect that you're giving them good equipment, you're giving them a good policy, you're giving them good training on that policy, they're using good discretion, and then you've got to look at it with the circumstances that they were facing at the time and make the call as to whether that's was the proper way to act or not. So don't try to write a policy that covers every given scenario, because you're not going to do it. A lot of people have tried, and so that's how Lexipol writes policy. Is we write it in a broader sense so that we're not painting the operator out in the field into a corner and removing discretion and training where that it needs to come into the mix, so they're operationally safe and people aren't getting hurt out there in the community.
Evolution of policy, evolution of the body camera. We're seeing more and more the ability to have policy-based recording, policy interacting with technology to automate. Your thoughts on how that pushes forward the system and really the ease of an officer just being able to do their job and adhering to policy through that automation?
Yeah, that's one of the exciting things about what utility provides, is that automation, taking your policy and then combining that with technology so that you can geofence When an officer gets in within a certain range of a call for service, automatically kicks on the camera. Things like that. That's one less decision, one less thing on that officer's mind when they're going to that call. And if we can start removing some of that and automate that, then they're that much safer. And so is the community that they serve. So that automation piece is really exciting. If you can take more and more of that decision making and side chatter in the brain of the officer that's responding to a call that they're not quite sure of, maybe it sounds really sketchy as they're getting there, they're getting a little bit of information, they're trying to form a picture in their head. If we can start removing some of that other side chatter, then that improves their performance out in the field. That's exciting.
Mm-hmm. Never asking an office technology and policy can do for them, working together. Really interesting to see how Lexipol has continued to evolve and encompass all the changes in policy and in policing, much like utility tries to with technology. What's next for Lexipol? Where is the industry moving, and where are we moving as a profession in law enforcement as it relates to policy?
It's an ever-changing landscape. One of the exciting things about Lexipol for me is the fact that we have a great reputation and history of providing really good service, great policies. We have an amazing team of content writers, subject matter experts, and legal scholars that come from public safety, that really understand law enforcement, corrections, fire, and can bring that expertise and that history to the table and be able to track those trends. Like I said, we're in 35 different states. So we do start talking about legislative trends, legislative changes, best practice changes. We've got a lot of feelers out there in the market. And so we see those trends and changes coming. So we're staying that much, more ahead of the game, if you will. And, it's an exciting time at Lexipol. Now we have not only policy and training, but we have an officer wellness app through Codico, and that's another exciting growth point for Lexipol. Very, very much needed in the law enforcement public safety industry. It's nice to see the stigma of mental health and wellness being removed and people opening their minds to the importance of that.
Looking forward to continued opportunities between Lexipol and utility as we focus on technology in the body camera, the automation, the policy, how that overlaps that. Your thoughts, and I'm projecting here a little bit. Your thoughts on new opportunities for technology and policy to continue to overlap.
Yeah, I mean, I think the opportunities are endless. When you start looking at our policies, like you said, when you start putting in requirements and limitations with technology today, and it's amazing what we can do with syncing those up. Like I said, to start taking some of that decision-making process off of the officer. I think we need to be careful not to take too much away, because again, we need to have that officer discretion out in the field, in my opinion. But the opportunities are endless. If there's an idea, there's a technology to make it happen.
Bill, thank you for your insight today and for spending some time with us on Coffee Talk. It certainly was a pleasure to have you. And again, Director of Professional Services for Lexipol, Bill McAuliffe. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.